Welcome to Hope for Anxiety and OCD, episode 19. Today's show is all about introversion. And if you're wondering what in the world does that have to do with anxiety, we're going to explain that in the show, that there's a connection between introverts being more likely to struggle with anxiety or depression. Sometime back, I had picked up a book, The Powerful Purpose of Introverts, and found this book to be so validating of my own experience and also provided some practical tips on how to thrive as an introvert. So I knew that I wanted to ask Holley to be on the show, and she so graciously agreed. So here is my interview with author Holley Gerth. So, Holley, I wanted to start by telling you a story that I think will help us dive into this conversation about introverts. I was sitting in my friend's living room, and I've known this couple for probably about 10 years now, and we were talking about theme parks. And they said, "Oh, hey, what do you think about going to this theme park?" And I said, that's a lot of people to be around, and it's outdoors and it's hot. And I said, if I had kids, it might be a different story because I would suffer through it for the kids. But I said, as an introvert with all that activity going on around me, going to a theme park does not sound very fun. And my friend looks at me, the husband, super serious, and says, "You're an introvert?" And I said, "Yes, I'm an introvert," but it was just so funny to me because we have all these misconceptions about what it means to be an introvert. And here's somebody that knew me for 10 years and wouldn't have pegged me as an introvert.
Yeah, I think that's a great story. That happens so often. And the example you gave of a theme park is such a good illustration of the brain differences between introverts and extroverts. So they feel best when there's a lot coming at them because it releases more dopamine in their system, which is their preferred neurotransmitter. And for us, it's just a little too much sometimes.
Right. The external stimulation of having to process everything that goes on around you and picking up even on little minute experiences, even conversations, sometimes really good conversations with friends that are maybe more rich and deep. I'll go home and I'll be thinking about that for a half an hour to an hour. Whereas I think other people just they can go home and go to sleep. And Carrie has to have processing time, which is just different.
Yes, we do. Our nervous systems are more sensitive, and so we take in more. They're like nuts with small holes, and that's why introverts reach their done points faster. And then we need to do that processing like you described, where we empty our net a little by thinking through things, and then we're ready for more.
Yeah. I know that in your book, you talk about how introverts are more prone towards anxiety and depression. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's actually related. It seems, they're still studying it, but it seems related again to that more sensitive nervous system. So we're just more impacted by the things that we experience and some of our brain wiring. It's just a vulnerability. And that's part of my story. And for a long time, I wanted to get rid of that part of me completely. I was like, God must have messed up and I want to get rid of it completely. But over time, I've realized it's actually tied to my strengths. So if you picture the core characteristics of who you are is like being on a continuum, and in the middle would be that nervous system that introverts have. And on the left side of the continuum would be anxiety, and that could be labeled struggle. But on the right side of the continuum, there would be a label that says strength. And that's where things like you described, that perceptiveness and empathy and ability to notice things is. So I think for introverts, when it comes to overcoming anxiety and depression, really saying this is tied to some of my strengths, and it's not about changing who I am, but moving toward the strength sides of those core parts of who we are that can go in either direction.
Yeah, those strength parts a lot of times are often overlooked in a society maybe that caters a little bit more towards extroverts.
Yeah, I think so. But it's surprising that actually about half the population is made up of introverts. We've just learned to act like extroverts when we're in public because, like you said, our culture is more extrovert centric. But I think that introverts and extroverts are actually an intentional complementary pairing on God's part, that He made both and we're better together. So I think that when introverts dare to be who they are and extroverts do the same, then we're all a lot better off.
I love that because I have had similar experiences, I think, to what you just shared of, okay, I feel awkward in social settings, or maybe I don't know what to say. I struggled at one period in my young adulthood, really, of making conversations with people, not knowing how to do kind of the small talk thing. I love the one-on-one deep conversations, but I didn't know how really to interact in a group of people. And I actually went through a period where I made myself talk to strangers, which sounds really funny, but it was my way of practicing small talk. And I knew that I wasn't going to necessarily run into or see these people ever again. So that made it a little bit easier to kind of like practice some of that stuff.
Yeah.
One of the things I liked that you said in the book was that you try to bring an extrovert with you to a party, but they also appreciate having an introvert, which I thought was really cool too.
Yeah, I call them my designated extrovert. So if I'm at a conference or somewhere like that, then I look for an extrovert. And it does work out well because they want to kind of flit from conversation to conversation and talk to as many people as possible a lot of the times. And then if there's one person that wants to go really in depth and tell me a long story and talk and maybe even cry for an hour, then they're like, you got this one, So we both have our strong points. And again, those are stereotypes. Of course, introverts can learn to network, like you said, and extroverts are, of course, caring people too. But I do think that when we can team up and help each other out, that can be really useful. And the reason why we prefer those conversation types for extroverts, they use a brain pathway for processing that's shorter, faster, more focused on the present. So they can pretty easily do that quick, small talk. It's also why they like talking on the phone more than introverts. And introverts use a pathway that's longer, more complex, takes into account the past, present, and future. So we need a bit of time to respond. But often when we do, it adds depth and insight, context to what we're saying in that conversation. So again, it's something that can be frustrating at times, but is also a strength. It's what makes you a great counselor, that you have the ability to use that longer pathway and go to those deeper places with your clients.
I absolutely believe that because there will be times where I'm outside of session and I'm thinking about a client and their situation in a little bit more depth, and I'm able to have some mental clarity. And the nice part about my job is I don't always have to think on the fly. I can come back and say, hey, I was thinking about this thing and I think it might fall in this area, or I think it might be helpful if we shifted direction over here a little bit. It's super frustrating when you're in a corporate environment, or even sometimes in church, you're in meetings and people are spitting out ideas. And sometimes that processing speed is a lot faster. And so for the introverts to know it's okay, I think, to come back and say, I thought about this a little bit more, and to not feel guilty for not being able to think on the fly like maybe we see other people doing.
Yeah, that's a great tip. One thing that I've learned through the process of writing this book is that extroverts just want a response. They don't necessarily need the response. And as an introvert, I tend to think I have to have my fully formed, as close to perfect as possible response before I say anything at all. But actually, extroverts just want to know that we're engaged and listening. And so I've found it's okay to say, I need some time to think about it because it really matters to me. Or I want you to know I'm listening to you and I hear you. I just need a little bit of time to work through that. And then let's set a time to get back together. And so that was freeing for me. I have a daughter who's an extrovert. And so I've learned to say to her things like that. I hear you. I am listening. Let me have just a little bit, and then I will get back to you, I promise. So that is one strategy. Also, preparing ahead of time can help us. Like as little in the moment processing that we have to do, that can be helpful. Like I'm sure you prepare for your sessions with clients. And then, like you said, you think about them afterwards. And that idea of saying to someone, especially in a meeting, hey, I'm going to get back to you by 8 a.m. tomorrow. I want to dig into this a little more. So preparation, and then knowing you can just use a response. You don't have to have the response. And then asking for time for follow-up. Those are 3 good strategies to help with that.
That's so good. I like having the practical things to say with other people, and that can help in a variety of different relationships that we're talking about, whether it's your boss or your spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, best friend, your child, like you named. This is just applicable in so many different areas. I'm curious for you, kind of like what that process was of really embracing your introversion in a different way, other than looking at it as a deficit, going from that to looking at it as a strength or as a God-given blessing.
Yeah, well, I did it by pushing myself into burnout, which I don't recommend. So especially when I first started publishing books, I started getting a lot of speaking invitations. And I literally told myself, I just have to be more of an extrovert now. Like, that's the job. And I said yes to everything, to everyone, without being very strategic about it. And at the end of one year where I traveled like 20 times, I was a keynote at a conference. And the next morning in the worship service, I just couldn't stop crying. And I felt like God saying, go home. And I knew he meant like, go home and take a nap because you are tired, but also go home to who I created you to be. And I realized that each of us are perfectly designed for God's purpose for our lives, not for anyone else's. But for ours, we have what we need. And so I went home and I went to counseling. That was part of my healing journey. I told my close people, hey, I'm not okay. I need to make some changes. I spent time with God and just asking, what have I taken on that you never asked me to? And started saying no more strategically and started saying yes more strategically, and realized that I didn't have to do all those things in order to fulfill God's purpose for me, that I could be an introvert and still make an impact, and that it was more than okay to just say, this is who I am, and I'm going to build my life around that. So it was a long journey, and I wouldn't recommend anyone do it that way, but that's how it worked for me.
I love that. I love that sense of, yes, I can fulfill God's call on my life. Whoever's hearing this, like, no matter what your personality is, no matter whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, you can still fulfill God's calling, and it's going to look like what he intends it to look like for your life, instead of trying to follow the pattern of other people. It's so tempting in the days of social media to look on a profile or a public figure and say, that person has it together, or I want to be like them. But really, we should be striving to be who God created us to be, unique and individual. And there's just, everyone, I believe, has a gift that they give to the world, that God has given us things to be able to give out to others. And that was just really beautiful how you shared that.
Yeah, I agree. And even when we look at those around us, a lot of times we assume they're extroverts, and often they're not. Like, some well-known introverts include Oprah, Jerry Seinfeld, Joanna Gaines, Abraham Lincoln, Max Lucado, Michael Jordan, Michael Phelps. I mean, the list goes on. And because we live in a more extrovert-centric culture, we do assume, oh, they're in public, they must be an extrovert. But there are actually a whole lot of introverts doing really remarkable things. And so I think that is something I've learned too, that when I see someone that I think, oh, they're an extrovert, to pause and be like, maybe not. maybe they're in their zone of what I call brilliance and belonging, where there's this thing that they do that brings them into a different place, but maybe they're an introvert just like me.
Do you feel at times like God's calling on you to do specific things has been totally scary?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I feel like that too. And I wanted to ask you that because even like putting out this podcast, like it's terrifying. And the only reason I continue doing it is because, well, one, I believe it's what God wants me to do. And two, I'm having enormous amounts of fun with it, talking to people and interviewing them. But it is scary to do new things or to put ourselves out there. And I think sometimes as Christians, we maybe have been fed this lie that if I'm doing something for the Lord or if I'm following God's calling on my life, somehow I'm supposed to have 100% confidence in that, and I'm not going to experience anxiety and I'm not going to experience fear. And I just wanted to dispel that myth because it's a myth.
Yeah, it is. I once looked at all the verses that say do not fear in scripture, and they're almost always to someone who's already afraid. So it's not like a command, don't ever feel fear. It's God saying to us in a reassuring way, you don't have to stay in that fear because I'm with you. And I realized that we are afraid when something matters to us. Like we don't get scared about things we don't care about, And I don't get scared that I'm never going to get to be, an accountant or engineer. And, probably the folks who love their jobs are like, they're not scared. They're never going to get to be a writer or a podcaster. It's the things that matter most to us that scare us most. So in that sense, the fear is never going away, or in a way we don't want it to, because that probably means that the passion is also going away. And so just recognizing that fear as proof that we're doing work that matters. And then I would say the day I stop being afraid is the day I should probably walk away, because it's the day I think I can do it on my own without God's help.
Wow.
Like fear keeps us dependent and saying, okay, God, this is bigger than me. I don't think I can do it, but I'm going to trust you can through me. And then we take the next step forward. But I think fear is just with us when we do things that are worth doing.
Right. That connection between fear and passion is so huge, because the passion is the thing that God gives you, I believe, to help you push through the fear. Like there's something in your heart that you feel like you have to speak up about, or you have to share, or you have to do. And that sometimes that anxiety is something that's almost a confirmation for me of like, okay, like you said, this is something that God's put on my heart and put in my life for a reason and a purpose. But I can also, with his help, move through that and move beyond that to the other side and do things that I couldn't do on my own.
Yeah. And it's really interesting that from a brain perspective, fear and excitement use the same circuitry. It's just about how we frame it to ourselves, whether we tell ourselves, like if we're getting ready to speak, if we're telling ourselves, I'm scared out of my mind, or I'm excited. And there have been studies that show if you tell yourself, I'm excited, that it helps, even if you feel like you're faking it. You may, like you're like, what am I saying? I'm not excited. I'm terrified. But if we just learn even to change some of that language and link it more to that passion and excitement, because it is the same kind of circuitry in our minds, that can help also.
I think some people should try that next time before going to a party. I am so excited to be with my friends, because that is true. You're excited to be with people, hopefully, that you love and enjoy. Let's talk about maybe some practical things that if people are struggling with anxiety in social settings or when they meet new people, those types of things. Are there any tips that you've found helpful for you or through your research?
Well, Susan Cain wrote a book called Quiet about introverts and also one for kids. And she uses the metaphor of extroverts are like helicopters, introverts are like airplanes. And so extroverts in social settings kind of immediately lift off, like they're just jump right in. And introverts need a runway. So to ease into it a bit more. And so if you're an introvert, it can actually help to get to places a little bit early so that you have time to get familiar with your surroundings, to feel comfortable there, see people come in one at a time instead of walking into a crowded room. Because it's tempting, right, as an introvert to come late.
Right.
Because we think that will help. But that any kind of preparation you can do ahead of time, even if it's just researching online, the restaurant or the venue, or looking at the people's Facebook profiles, not in a stalkery way, but in a I'm getting familiar with these people way, then that is helping yourself have a runway. And so I think that's one thing, or even doing research ahead of time, like saying, okay, what are some questions I want to ask people tonight? Having something. So when you're put on the spot, there's something in your toolkit for using. And then just honoring your done point, knowing that because we process deeply and we take in a whole lot, that it's okay if we're just done before other people, that it's okay if we're just like, I've had enough. I'm ready to go home. For socializing to be more about quality than quantity, I think is a helpful shift. And then finding ways to make bigger groups feel smaller. So in a group saying, how can I talk to one person at a time? Or taking on a role or responsibility, like at the holidays saying, I'm going to wash dishes because that means I get to stand at the sink and catch my breath for a few minutes. Or I'm going to take the dog for a walk. Or I'll be the one to run to the store. Often when introverts have a role or a responsibility, social settings become more comfortable. It's that unstructured time where it's just about like the back and forth conversations that aren't always our favorite, that can be challenging. So give yourself a runway or look for a role or responsibility when you're in the setting.
One of the things that you mentioned that I've found super helpful for me, and it seems really silly, but I will become overwhelmed if I don't look at the menu beforehand. If I'm going to a new restaurant, it's like there are too many choices and too many options, and I feel like I have to read this whole thing and investigate it. And maybe other people don't look at menus that way, but when you're highly sensitive and that's how you process the information, it's just easier for me to almost decide before I go to the restaurant what I'm going to eat, or at least narrow it down to a few choices versus just having to do that all at once. And then usually people are trying to communicate with you as well. Like, oh, hey, how are you doing? It's like, okay, I can't talk and read and think and everything all at the same time. I've found it helpful at parties. I think I read this in a book a long time ago. I had read a book as part of my process called The Introvert Advantage. I don't even know if that's still out, but that book really helped me understand myself. And I think one of the things they said was, don't be afraid to sit down and let people come talk to you. And I had an interesting experience at a networking event one time where everyone was mixing and mingling, and I just needed a break from meeting new people. So I sat down on this sofa, and this extrovert woman came over and she started talking to me, and I was thinking, oh gosh, I came over here so I could like just sit down and have a break. But she interpreted that as like, oh, you're not having a good time. You're not mixing and mingling. And somehow like it's my role in this networking event to come over and rope you back in. So that was just a little kind of funny misunderstanding. But I think it's okay to kind of take a break or observe for a little while. And sometimes people don't understand that that's what you're doing. They just think that you're disengaged or not having a good time.
Yeah, and I think that's a common misconception. I think one reason why is that brain and nervous system wiring differences. That means that introverts and extroverts experience happiness differently. And so for extroverts, happiness looks like enthusiasm and excitement. And for introverts, calm and contentment. And so that extrovert assumed because you are over there being calm and content that you must not be happy at the party. And so our loved ones can do the same if you're in an introvert extrovert marriage or friendship or kids and parents. And so understanding that difference can be helpful. And also as introverts communicating, saying, I'm really enjoying just watching everyone, or just making it overt that we're in our happy place. It just looks different than it does for extroverts. But a lot of times that's what's going on. And I love your strategy of menus. I do the same thing, and I'd never thought about it as an introvert HSP thing. But that makes so much sense. And I think I'm going to do that in broader ways too. Like if I'm going to a conference, I'm going to say this conference is a menu. I don't have to eat everything on it. Like,
Yes. Yes.
What do I most want to consume while I'm here? And what will be the right amount for me that I get what I need, but I don't overindulge in a way that makes me not feel good by the time I'm going home. And I think you could do the same with a vacation, with a lot of different things. So I love that strategy.
That's so true of conferences, because they will literally have like, okay, and here's the breakfast for the new people, and then here's all of your conference schedule and the special lunch and then the dinner evening thing. And I look at that and I'm like, no, I don't want to go all to all of that. Like when you're having your evening 8 p.m. thing, I want to be in my PJs reading and decompressing, because I've been around people all day long. What are you thinking? So that's really funny too that you mentioned conferences, because that's been my experience of looking at them like, we have way too much stuff on this menu. I'm not going to go to all of that.
Yeah. And so just saying, I'm going to pick and choose what's going to add the most value and not worry about the rest. Again, it's that quality over quantity, such an important strategy, especially for introverts.
Mm-hmm. I know that things like trips or being around family for long periods, even people that you love and value. My spouse and I, we have introvert time. There's times where we just kind of want to go to, a separate space in the house and just read or relax. And we just kind of check in with each other about that. Like, hey, is it, are you cool if I go here and read? Oh yeah, that's fine. I just kind of need to decompress, and we don't always have to be around each other all the time, and there's a peace and a communication about that. I've had vacations with friends where, like, I can think my best friend and I, we kind of had an understanding of just like, we need time alone at the end of the day. We're going to be around each other all day, doing fun things, going places and seeing people, and then there needs to be some kind of decompression time at the end where we're not having to be fully engaged or talking to each other or doing an activity every second of the day. I think that's important in terms of when introverts are planning things like vacations, to really take that time and be gentle with themselves. Of, you don't have to absorb every single moment. You can have some happiness in your peace and contentment and relaxation at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think it can be helpful to ask each other, what will help you enjoy this vacation, the holidays, whatever it is that you're going into with another person. And so that gives introverts the opportunity to say, I'm going to need a nap. Or I'm going to need an hour to read every day. And the extroverts would say, I'm going to need to have a little adventure every day, whatever it is. And so a lot of times we just assume that other people are wired like us. And so we are afraid to ask for what we need, or we miss seeing what someone else needs. And so I think just having those conversations can be helpful.
There's so much about this that as you start to develop an awareness of yourself, your own body, even how you feel physically and emotionally when you're around other people, how you feel physically and emotionally doing certain tasks. Some may feel more draining to you than others, and how you rejuvenate that mental and emotional energy. And if you can develop some awareness over those things, then it allows you to know what you need. And if you know what you need, then you can advocate for what you need. And there's so many pieces, I think, that go together with that. But I hope that some of this conversation helps spark like self-reflection in our listeners, just of, okay, how do I really feel in these situations? With anxiety, there's a tendency to just avoid and just say, it makes me feel uncomfortable. Like, I'm not doing it. Party with 20 people and I only know one person, I'm not going. And I would just encourage people really to say, instead of tapping out and avoiding, to say, how can I set myself up for success in this situation instead? Like some of the tips that we talked about a little bit earlier. How can I engage socially in a way that's going to be most comfortable for me, understanding that it may not necessarily be 100% comfortable.
Yeah, that was a big aha for me with my anxiety, is realizing that avoidance actually reinforces anxiety, because we never learn that we actually can do it, that we can make it through the party or the speech or whatever it is that's making us anxious. And so the more we go through things that trigger our anxiety and come out okay on the other side, that's what actually decreases it. And so that has been a big aha for me personally, is just saying, like you said, okay, this is making me anxious, but I'm going to get some strategies and call for backup if I need it. And I'm going to live through it. And usually on the other side, I say, that wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. Like, what I come up with in my head is usually so much worse than what actually happens. And so I think that's great insight for your listeners that you're sharing, that, yeah, lean into it when it's tempting to pull away.
Are there things that you tell yourself or to get through some of those situations? Or is there a way that what the tipping point is? How do I know that this is going to be too much for my system, or it's something that I can manage and kind of get through with a little self-encouragement?
Yeah, I think asking, am I making this decision out of fear or out of intentionally taking care of who I am as an introvert? Because those are two different things. So if there's an event that would probably be beneficial, and I know that, but I'm just like, I'm scared, so I'm not going, then I try not to let myself off the hook. But if I'm saying, I'm exhausted and I know the close people in my life need some things from me, and I've got to prioritize my energy, and this event is just not making the cut because it's a want to, not a need to, then that's a different thing. And just saying it's okay to prioritize what I spend my emotion and energy on, especially as an introvert. And so just asking, where is this coming from? Is it from a fearful place or is it from a proactive place? I think can be helpful.
That's really, really good. So before we end here, at the end of every podcast, I like to ask the guest to share a story of hope, which is a time in which you received hope from God or another person.
Okay. So my story of hope is my family story. I went through about a decade of infertility. My husband and I couldn't have our own kiddos. And so we ended up adopting a 20-year-old.
Wow.
Who basically aged out of the foster system. And so she's now 27. And so she got married, and we are Nana and Poppy to Eula and Clement. And so I literally wore a ring on my finger that said hope for all those years. And the ending to our story is not at all what I would have imagined, but it is now one that I would not trade for anything. So I think about that still when I'm in a situation where I'm waiting or I'm uncertain of the outcome, just knowing that God's working out something probably better than I could have imagined on my own.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. So, Holley, tell us a little bit about your book.
It's called The Powerful Purpose of Introverts, Why the World Needs You to Be You. And I spent years doing the research behind it. It has tons of information, but I also did a survey of my blog subscribers about their biggest challenges as introverts, and I used that. I got thousands of responses. And so digging into that, I noticed patterns of struggles, but also patterns of strengths. And so the book really unpacks what are the gifts and strengths the world has to receive from introverts, and how can you individually recognize those strengths in yourself and maximize them and overcome the struggles that might get in your way. And so I hope that it's both encouraging, but also very practical. There's a lot of interactive tools in it. There's questions for reflection. There's all kinds of things like that. And if you're an extrovert, I've heard from several extroverts now that reading it has helped their relationships with an introvert in their life. So if you're married to an introvert, or you're parenting one, or if you just have a lot of friends that you love who are introverts, I think it can be beneficial for extroverts too. But it has been a bestseller and resonated more than I even imagined. So I hope everyone can get this message, because I think it is something I wish I'd had 20 years ago. It would have changed the trajectory of my life. It would have protected me from going to that place of burnout. And so I want everybody else to have it so that they do not have to go through what I did. You can let me be your warning.
Absolutely. I've really enjoyed it. It's felt so validating for me to read. And I knew some about introverts from reading that I had done in the past and kind of my own journey of self-discovery. But reading the book this time with all of the interweaves that you talked about of the research that you did and the brain science has been like, oh yeah, like that makes so much sense. Like I get it. And there are little checklists and different things, and it's been a good read. So thank you for writing it and sharing that with us. And thank you for being on the show today and just sharing your wisdom there.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this interview with Holley. If there's nothing else that you take away, I hope that you know that you were created uniquely by God with a purpose and intention in mind. He did not make a mistake by making you an introvert if you are an introvert, and he did not make a mistake by making you an extrovert if you're an extrovert. So go and embrace and be all that God has called you to be. At Hope for Anxiety and OCD, we talk about how we are here to reduce shame, increase hope, and develop healthier connections with God and others. If you know somebody that needs this message, I would encourage you to share the show with them. You can also share your support for the show by writing us a review on iTunes. Thanks so much for listening. Hope for Anxiety and OCD is a production of By the Well Counseling in Smyrna, Tennessee. Our original music is by Brandon Maingram, and audio editing was completed by Benjamin Bynum. Until next time, may you be comforted by God's great love for you.